It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the cool breeze and golden leaves gave everything a peaceful, almost serene feeling. James, a 35-year-old man with a steady routine, decided to take his usual walk with his loyal dog Max. Max, a large German shepherd, was full of energy and always eager for their daily stroll through the quiet park near their home. The park itself wasn't particularly busy. It was more of a wooded area, with dirt paths winding through trees that were shedding their leaves. The stillness of the day was calming, and James breathed in the fresh air, enjoying the quiet escape from his otherwise bustling life. As they walked, Max moved as he always did, nose to the ground, sniffing every corner and following invisible trails. But halfway through their walk, something changed. Max suddenly froze, his body stiff, ears perked, eyes locked on something just ahead. Without warning, he began barking, first softly, then more urgently. James furrowed his brow. Max was a well-trained dog, not prone to barking for no reason. His intense behavior immediately caught James's attention. "What is it, boy?" James asked, giving the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, let's go." But Max didn't budge. His paws were firmly planted on the ground, and his barking only grew louder. It was as if he was trying to warn James about something. Curious and a bit uneasy, James followed Max's gaze toward a cluster of bushes. That's when he saw it. Nestled within the bushes was what looked like an old, abandoned nest. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just a tangle of twigs and dried leaves that had probably been there for months. Still, Max's reaction was odd, almost too intense for something so ordinary. James sighed. "You're making a big deal out of nothing, aren't you?" But Max wouldn't stop. He barked again, this time even more frantically, as if urging James to come closer. Reluctantly, James stepped forward, peering more closely at the nest. It didn't seem out of place, just an old bird's nest perhaps, but the way Max was acting gave him pause. The dog was acting as if something dangerous was lurking inside. James knelt down, brushing aside some of the leaves and debris to get a better look. There was nothing immediately alarming, but there was something off. The nest was more disturbed than it should have been for something abandoned. The twigs were scattered, and there was a faint, strange smell in the air that James couldn't quite place. "What on earth?" he murmured, leaning in closer, his curiosity now fully piqued. Max let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the nest, his body tense. James's heart skipped a beat. It was rare for Max to growl like that, especially at something inanimate. But there was no denying it. Something about this spot was making the dog extremely uneasy. Still, James hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave, chalking it up to Max overreacting. Maybe it was just an old animal scent lingering in the nest. But another part of him, the part that trusted Max's instincts after years of companionship, wasn't so sure. "Okay, boy, let's take a closer look," James muttered to himself, more to break the silence than anything else. As he carefully reached out to move a few more branches, Max let out another growl, followed by a sharp bark. The sudden sound startled James, making him pull back his hand quickly. His heart was racing now, a mixture of adrenaline and uncertainty flooding his senses. Nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. James stood up, glancing around the quiet park. The stillness that he had found so peaceful earlier now seemed eerie, almost oppressive. He scanned the area, half expecting to see someone watching them. But there was no one, just him, Max, and the mysterious nest. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "We're probably just overthinking this," he said aloud, as much for his own reassurance as for Max's. But Max didn't seem convinced. He continued barking, his eyes locked on the nest as if it held some deep, hidden danger. James rubbed the back of his neck, torn between wanting to leave and the gnawing feeling that something more was going on. Finally, he decided to call it a day. They could come back tomorrow, when the daylight was stronger, and he could investigate with a clearer mind. Perhaps then he could figure out why Max was so fixated on this spot. As they walked back toward home, James found himself glancing over his shoulder, his mind still lingering on the strange nest and Max's unnerving reaction to it. The park, usually a place of comfort, now felt unsettling, as if there was something watching them from the shadows. Max had calmed down slightly as they walked away, but every few steps he would look back, his ears perked and alert. James couldn't help but feel the same unease. What was it about that nest? And why was Max so disturbed? The questions swirled in his mind as they made their way home. It could be nothing. Just a strange coincidence, maybe an old animal scent that had triggered Max's instincts. But what if it was something more? James pushed the thought aside as they entered their quiet street, but the unease lingered. He decided that tomorrow, he would go back. He had to know what was inside that nest, and why Max couldn't leave it alone. The next day, the unease from the previous afternoon still lingered in James's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that nest, and Max's behavior had only heightened his curiosity. So after work, he decided to return to the park with Max by his side, this time more prepared to investigate the spot that had captured both of their attention. The evening was just as calm as the day before, with the late autumn sun casting long shadows over the park. The air was cool, and the leaves crunched underfoot as James and Max walked the now familiar path back to the nest. Max seemed more alert than usual. His ears perked as they neared the same bushes where he had barked so persistently the day before. James felt his pulse quicken as they approached the spot. The nest looked the same as it had before, an unremarkable tangle of twigs and leaves. But something about it still felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the air around them seemed heavier, more tense. Max stopped just short of the nest and began barking again, his tail stiff, his posture tense. James sighed, his curiosity now fully piqued. "All right, let's figure out what's going on here," he muttered to himself, kneeling down in front of the nest. He gently pushed aside some of the leaves and twigs, expecting to find nothing more than an old animal den or remnants of a bird's home. But as he moved the debris aside, something caught his eye. Beneath the leaves was a small, metallic object, barely visible, half buried in the dirt. James's brow furrowed as he carefully pulled it free. It was a small, rusted key, worn from what looked like years of exposure to the elements. "What the?" James whispered, holding the key up to the light. It didn't look like much. It's not that, but its presence was strange. Why would a key be hidden here, of all places? Max's barking grew louder, more urgent. He pawed at the ground near the nest, as if trying to tell James that there was more to be found. Following Max's lead, James dug a little deeper, moving aside more of the debris. And then, buried beneath the leaves and dirt, he saw it. Something far more disturbing than an old key, a piece of fabric, torn, dirty, and stained. James's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The fabric looked like it had once been part of a shirt or maybe a jacket. And the stain? It didn't take long for James to realize it was blood. His stomach turned as he stared at the ground. This wasn't just some random object discarded in the woods. Something bad had happened here. Max barked again, his growl low and steady now, as if warning James to stay alert. James stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped the dirt off his jeans. He needed to think. Who did this belong to? How long had it been here? And why was it hidden beneath that nest? His mind raced with questions, none of them comforting. There was no doubt in his mind that this was serious, and it was no longer something he could ignore. James took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed the police. He wasn't entirely sure what to say. How do you explain that your dog found something suspicious under a nest? But there was no turning back now. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line asked. James swallowed hard. Yeah, I think I found something. I'm at the park near my house, and there's a nest, and I found what looks like blood-stained fabric, and... Sir, stay calm, the operator interrupted. Can you give us your location? James quickly gave the details, his heart pounding as he explained the situation as best as he could. Within minutes, they assured him that officers were on their way. He hung up the phone and crouched down beside Max, who had stopped barking but remained alert, his eyes fixed on the nest. James's mind was spinning. What had he stumbled upon? And more importantly, who had left these things behind? He didn't have to wait long. The distant sound of sirens cut through the quiet evening, and soon 2 police cars pulled up at the edge of the park. Officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached James and Max. "Are you the one who called?" one of the officers asked, her tone professional but curious. James nodded, pointing toward the nest. It's over here. My dog found it yesterday, but when I came back today, I found this." He showed them the key and the fabric, explaining how he had discovered it. The officers exchanged glances, then moved toward the nest. One of them carefully examined the area while the other took notes, asking James more questions about when and how he had found the objects. James could tell they were taking it seriously, but there was still an air of skepticism. After all, this was just an ordinary park. Nothing like this ever happened here. As the officers worked, James watched, his thoughts racing. Something told him that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't going to be solved easily. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers turned to James. "We're going to take this evidence back to the station for further investigation," she said. "In the meantime, if you notice anything else unusual, don't hesitate to call us." James nodded, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The police were involved now, but that didn't mean the mystery was over. Far from it. As the officers left, James stood there with Max, staring at the now empty nest. What had they stumbled upon? And why did it feel like the worst was yet to come? James couldn't sleep that night. The eerie discovery at the park kept replaying in his mind. The rusted key, the blood-stained fabric, Max's relentless barking. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured the scene over and over, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be uncovered, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The police had taken the evidence seriously, but as James lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he wondered if they really understood the gravity of the situation. What if they thought it was just an old remnant from some forgotten accident? Or worse, what if they dismissed it entirely? After all, it wasn't like there were any other signs of foul play. No body, no witnesses, just a few unsettling items buried under an abandoned nest. Max, curled up at the foot of the bed, let out a soft whimper in his sleep. Even in his dreams, the dog seemed troubled. James sighed and glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. The room was silent, but his mind was far from at rest. Morning came slowly, the sunlight creeping through the blinds and casting long shadows across the room. James knew he couldn't stay home and ignore what had happened. He needed answers. More than that, he needed to know that the police were taking this as seriously as he was. After a quick breakfast, he decided to call the local precinct. His stomach churned as the phone rang, each second dragging out longer than the last. Finally, a voice answered. "City Police Department. How can I help you?" "Hi, this is James Thompson. I called last night about something strange I found in the park, the key and the fabric." There was a brief pause before the officer on the other end spoke. "Ah, yes, I see the report here. The officers on duty collected the items and they're currently being processed. Did you find anything else?" James hesitated, unsure if he was overstepping, but his curiosity won out. "No, I didn't go back yet. I was just wondering. Have you found anything? Is there any connection to, anything criminal?" The officer's response was calm but distant. "It's still too early to say, Mr. Thompson. We're running standard tests on the fabric, but there's no immediate indication of a crime scene. It's possible the items were left there by accident or have been there for years." James's heart sank. He had hoped for more. Some sign that they were treating this as the serious matter it felt like. But all he got was bureaucracy and caution. "Right," he muttered. "Okay, thanks." As he hung up the phone, a wave of frustration washed over him. He understood that they had procedures to follow, but why did it feel like they were dismissing this too quickly? Something was wrong. Max's instincts had never failed him before, and James trusted his dog more than anyone. Without thinking twice, he grabbed Max's leash and headed back to the park. If the police weren't going to treat this with urgency, he would. The walk to the park felt longer than usual. Max trotted beside him, alert and focused, as if he knew exactly where they were headed. When they reached the clearing, James's breath caught in his throat. The nest was still there, untouched since the police had left, but the area felt different. It was as though the peaceful park had been tainted by the discovery, and now every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Max led the way, pulling James toward the nest. He sniffed the ground around it, his nose twitching as he searched for more clues. James crouched down beside him, scanning the area for anything he might have missed the first time. For a moment, everything was still. The wind rustled through the trees, and Max's ears twitched in response. But there was nothing else. No more objects, no more signs of trouble. And yet, James couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. Suddenly, Max stiffened. His body tense as he looked past the nest, his eyes locked on something in the distance. James followed his gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, he saw nothing, just the thick line of trees surrounding the park. But then, just barely visible through the branches, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure. It was too far away to make out clearly, but there was no doubt about it. Someone was there, watching. James's blood ran cold. His first instinct was to grab Max and leave, to get as far away from the park as possible. But then the figure turned, disappearing into the trees, leaving James with more questions than answers. "Come on, Max," James whispered, pulling the leash. "Let's go." They hurried out of the park, James glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The walk back home was filled with tension, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was that? Had they been watching him the whole time? And why did they run when he noticed them? By the time they reached his front door, James was on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. Someone didn't want him digging deeper. As soon as he got inside, he locked the door, his hands shaking slightly as he bolted it shut. Max sat by his side, his eyes still alert, ears perked. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. James sat down, trying to collect his thoughts. The police had brushed him off, and now there was someone watching him. What had he stumbled upon? And more importantly, was he in danger? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just some forgotten nest in the park. There was something much bigger happening, and James was in the middle of it. The next morning, James found himself back at the park. He knew it was risky, but the need for answers outweighed his fear. His mind was still buzzing with the image of that figure disappearing into the trees. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. And that made James even more determined to find out what was really going on. Max seemed just as eager, pulling at the leash as they retraced their steps to the clearing. The autumn air was brisk, but James barely noticed the cold. His heart raced with anticipation as they approached the nest, the same sense of unease hanging in the air as before. This time, James hadn't come alone. He'd brought along his friend Mark, someone he trusted, who had agreed to help him look into the mystery. Mark was the type of person who loved a good puzzle and wasn't easily spooked, which made him the perfect companion for this strange situation. "You really think this is something serious?" Mark asked as they walked, his tone curious but not overly concerned. "I don't know what to think," James admitted. "But Max has never reacted like this before. There's something here, Mark. I can feel it." Mark nodded, eyeing the nest as they drew closer. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." They arrived at the same spot, the nest still sitting in its eerie silence. Max immediately started sniffing around, his tail rigid as he circled the area. James knelt down beside the nest again, this time more determined to dig deeper. He carefully moved aside the leaves and twigs, checking for anything else that might be hidden beneath the surface. The key and the blood-stained fabric had been disturbing enough, but something told James there was more to find. "Here," Mark said, handing him a small trowel he'd brought along. "Let's see what's underneath." James took the tool and began to dig, his hands trembling slightly as he sifted through the dirt. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, seemed amplified in the stillness of the park. And then, just when he thought he might be overreacting, his trowel hit something hard, his breath caught in his throat. He paused, exchanging a glance with Mark, who crouched down beside him, his expression growing serious. "Did you hear that?" James asked. Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the spot where James had been digging. "Yeah, keep going." James dug a little deeper, and soon the object came into view. It was a small metal box, half buried in the dirt. The edges were rusted, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, his voice low. James carefully lifted the box from the ground, wiping away the dirt with his sleeve. It was heavy for its size, and the lock on the front was broken, rusted beyond repair. Whatever was inside had clearly been hidden here for a reason. With a quick glance at Max, who was still circling the area, James opened the box. Inside, he found something that made his stomach churn. A stack of photographs, yellowed with age but still clear enough to make out the faces of the people in them. The photos showed a group of men standing together in various locations, all of them looking serious, almost grim. But it wasn't the men that made James's skin crawl. It was what they were standing next to. In each photo, the men were posed beside a large, ominous-looking structure, something that looked like an abandoned building or a bunker. The locations varied, but the structure was always the same. And in every picture, the expressions on their faces were cold, emotionless. "What the hell?" James whispered, flipping through the photos. Mark leaned in for a closer look. "What is that place? It looks creepy." James shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever this is, it's not good." As they continued to sort through the contents of the box, they found more strange items, an old map marked with coordinates and what looked like pages torn from a journal. The writing was smudged, but some of it was still legible. One line stood out to James. "We had to bury it. No one can know." He stared at the words, his heart pounding. What had these men buried, and why had they gone to such lengths to hide it? Mark's face had gone pale. "James, this is getting serious. We need to take this to the police." "I know," James said, his voice tense, "but they didn't believe me the first time. They brushed it off." Mark nodded, understanding the dilemma. "Then we need more proof. Something concrete." James agreed. If they could figure out where the photos were taken, maybe one of those buildings or bunkers, they might be able to connect the dots. The map in the box could be the key to solving this puzzle. "Let's check these coordinates," Mark suggested, pointing to the map. "Maybe it'll lead us to that place." Just as they were about to stand up, Max started growling again, his eyes fixed on the trees beyond the clearing. James's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. Someone was watching them. "Mark, we need to go," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." They quickly gathered the box and its contents, stuffing everything into James's backpack. Max was already on edge, his growling growing louder as they started to walk away. James kept his eyes on the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement, but whoever had been there was gone now. The walk back to the car was tense, both James and Mark keeping their heads on a swivel, ready for anything. By the time they reached the car, James's nerves were frayed. As they drove away, James's mind raced with questions. Who were the men in the photos? What had they buried? And more importantly, who was watching them? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whoever had hidden those things in the park clearly didn't want them to be found. And now, James had a target on his back. James couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even after they had driven away from the park and returned to the relative safety of his house, the unease lingered, wrapping itself around him like a heavy fog. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow more sinister. He couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see someone lurking in the dark. Mark sat across from him at the kitchen table, the metal box and its disturbing contents laid out between them. Max paced around the room, still agitated from their earlier discovery. "Okay," Mark said, breaking the tense silence. "Let's go over what we know." James nodded, though his mind was still spinning. The photographs, the torn journal pages, the map, none of it made sense yet, but he had the sinking feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much bigger. "These men," Mark continued, picking up one of the old photos, "they're clearly part of something. A group, maybe? And whatever they're doing, they've been to different locations. Look, each of these places looks like a bunker or some kind of abandoned structure." James leaned over the table, staring at the photo in Mark's hand. The men stood in front of an imposing concrete building, their expressions cold, unfeeling. It looked like the kind of place you'd want to avoid, hidden deep in some forgotten corner of the world. And yet, they were drawn to it. "And that line in the journal," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We had to bury it. No one can know." "What the hell does that mean?" Mark frowned, flipping through the smudged journal pages. "It could be anything, a secret they didn't want anyone to find. But why here? Why bury something in a random park?" "That's what doesn't make sense," James replied, running a hand through his hair. It's such a public place. You'd think they'd want to hide something like that somewhere more remote. Mark tapped the map with his finger. Maybe this park is just one piece of the puzzle. Look at the coordinates. They point to different locations. What if each of these places is connected somehow? The thought sent a shiver down James's spine. Could there be more to this than just one hidden secret? What if these men had been traveling from place to place, leaving pieces of their plan, or whatever they were involved in, scattered across different locations? Before they could delve deeper into the theory, Max let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the front door. James's heart skipped a beat, and Mark immediately turned his attention to the window. Do you think? Mark started, but James was already on his feet, moving toward the door with Max close behind. He peered through the peephole, his breath catching in his throat. At first, there was nothing, just the empty street illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. But then he saw it, parked a little too far down the street to be random. A car, dark, inconspicuous, but definitely out of place in his quiet neighborhood. James stepped back from the door, his pulse racing. Someone's out there, he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Mark stood up, crossing the room to peer out the window. We need to call the police, he said, his voice firm. This is getting serious. James nodded, but the weight of their previous interactions with the police pressed on his mind. Would they even take him seriously this time? Or would they brush it off again, just like before? Still, they couldn't ignore the growing danger. He pulled out his phone, dialing the police station, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for someone to answer. This is James Thompson. I think I'm being followed. Someone's parked outside my house. I found something in the park yesterday. There were photographs, evidence of something dangerous. You need to come. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but James could sense the underlying skepticism. Sir, can you describe the vehicle and the situation for me? James did his best to explain, detailing the dark car outside and the strange discoveries they had made at the park. He half expected the dispatcher to brush him off, but to his surprise, they took his report more seriously this time. We're sending an officer to your location now. Stay inside and keep your doors locked, the dispatcher instructed. James hung up the phone, his heart still pounding. They're sending someone, he told Mark, trying to keep his voice steady. Mark nodded, though his eyes were still fixed on the window. Good. But we need to be careful, James. Whoever's out there, if they know we found that box, they won't stop until they get it back. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours as they waited for the police to arrive. Max sat by the door, his ears perked and alert, as if he could sense the tension in the air. James couldn't help but think about what they had uncovered. The photographs, the journal. The implications were staggering. Whoever these men were, they had gone to great lengths to keep their secrets hidden. And now, James and Mark had stumbled right into the middle of it. Finally, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. James rushed to the window, relief flooding through him as he saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling up outside. But his relief was short-lived. Before the officer even stepped out of the vehicle, the dark car that had been parked down the street suddenly roared to life, speeding off into the night. James's stomach churned. Whoever had been watching them was gone, and they had escaped before the police could even question them. The officer knocked on the door a moment later, and James opened it cautiously, explaining the situation as best as he could. The officer listened intently, taking notes, but there was a familiar look of uncertainty in his eyes. You're saying someone's following you because of what you found in the park? The officer asked, his tone measured. James nodded. Yes, the box, the photos, it's all connected. I don't know what's going on, but someone doesn't want us to find out. The officer sighed, clearly trying to remain professional. We'll file a report, and I'll have patrols keep an eye on the area tonight. But without any solid evidence that you're in immediate danger, there's not much more we can do right now. It was exactly what James had feared. Once again, the police were reluctant to dig deeper, leaving him feeling vulnerable and exposed. After the officer left, James sat down at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. What are we going to do, Mark? We can't just sit around and wait for something bad to happen. Mark was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "We're not going to wait. We're going to find out what's going on. Those coordinates, if we follow them, we might be able to figure out what these men were doing and why they're so desperate to keep it hidden." James looked up at him, a mix of fear and determination in his eyes. "You really think that's a good idea?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but it's the only lead we have." The decision to follow the coordinates wasn't an easy one, but James and Mark knew they had no other choice. The police were reluctant to fully dive into the situation, and whoever was watching them clearly wasn't going to stop until they had silenced the two of them. The only option left was to take the risk and uncover the truth themselves. Early the next morning, James packed a small bag, flashlights, a map, and a few snacks just in case. His heart raced as he checked over the gear, knowing that this wasn't going to be a casual outing. Max, sensing the tension, stood by the door, wagging his tail in anticipation, but there was an edge of alertness in his stance. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, pulling up in his car. He was trying to sound casual, but James could hear the concern in his voice. "No," James admitted, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "But I don't see any other way." Mark nodded in agreement. "Let's get to the bottom of this." The coordinates they had found in the box led to a remote area about an hour outside of town. As they drove, the city gradually gave way to open fields and dense woods, the roads becoming narrower and more isolated. James couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see the dark car trailing them again. But for now, the road was clear. The farther they drove, the more uneasy James became. The landscape was desolate, with nothing but overgrown brush and trees lining the road. It was the kind of place where people went to be forgotten, far from prying eyes. The perfect place to hide something or someone. Finally, they reached their destination. The coordinates had led them to a small dirt path that cut through the trees. Mark parked the car at the entrance, the forest stretching out ahead of them like a dark, tangled web. "This is it," Mark said, checking the map. "The coordinates point just a little further up the trail." James swallowed hard, looking down the narrow path that seemed to disappear into the trees. Every instinct in his body told him to turn around, to leave before they got in too deep. But the need for answers pushed him forward. With Max leading the way, they started down the path, the forest closing in around them. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that clung to your skin and filled your lungs. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above, casting long shadows across the ground. As they walked, the path twisted and turned, growing narrower and more overgrown. Branches scraped against their arms, and the underbrush crunched beneath their boots. James's heart pounded in his chest, his senses on high alert. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated building, one that matched the eerie structures from the photos. The concrete walls were cracked and covered in vines, the windows broken and the door hanging off its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something about it that felt wrong. "This is it," Mark said, his voice low. "This is the place from the photos." James stared at the building, his pulse quickening. "What do you think we'll find inside?" Mark shrugged, though his expression was tense. "Only one way to find out." They approached the building cautiously, stepping over the crumbling foundation and broken glass. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Flashlights in hand, they stepped inside, the beams of light cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, save for a few rusted chairs and a broken table in the corner. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, the floor littered with debris. James's heart raced as they moved deeper into the building, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. Every step echoed off the walls, the sound unnerving in the stillness. Then, Max started growling. James froze, his flashlight flicking toward the far end of the room. Max's growl was low, dangerous, his body tense as he stared at a door at the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, James could see the faint glint of something metal. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, his pulse pounding in his ears. Max didn't move, his growl intensifying. Mark came up beside James, his flashlight pointed at the door. "Let's check it out." With a deep breath, James pushed the door open, revealing a small hidden room. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were boxes. Metal boxes, identical to the one they had found in the park. James's stomach turned as he realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. "This isn't just one secret," Mark muttered, his voice tight. "It's a whole operation." James stepped forward, opening one of the boxes. Inside, he found more photos. Photos of different men, standing in front of similar buildings in different locations. There were more journal pages, more maps, but one thing stood out more than anything else: a list of names. James's blood ran cold as he scanned the list. It was long, and next to each name was a location, coordinates, just like the ones they had followed. Some of the names had been crossed out, others left untouched. "What is this?" James whispered, his voice trembling. Mark picked up one of the lists, his face pale. "These are people they've been targeting." James's heart raced as the realization hit him. These men weren't just hiding something, they were part of a much larger conspiracy. And now, James and Mark were on that list. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice urgent. "If they find out we've been here..." James didn't need to be told twice. They gathered as much evidence as they could, stuffing the photographs and lists into their bags. Max growled again, his body tense, as if sensing the danger closing in around them. Just as they were about to leave, they heard it, a car engine roaring to life in the distance. James's heart skipped a beat. "They're here," Mark whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Without wasting another second, they bolted from the building, Max leading the way. The car engine grew louder, the sound of tires crunching on gravel, sending a jolt of adrenaline through James's body. They reached the edge of the clearing just in time to see the dark car from the night before, speeding down the dirt road toward them. James's heart pounded in his chest as he realized they were trapped. "Run!" Mark shouted, and they sprinted into the woods, their only hope to outrun whoever was coming for them. James's lungs burned as he ran through the dense forest, the trees blurring past him. Every thud of his footsteps echoed in his ears, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. Behind him, the roar of the approaching car grew louder. They were being hunted, and there was no doubt now. The men who had left those photographs, journals, and maps behind had found them. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "Faster!" Mark yelled, his voice strained with panic as he ran beside James, dodging branches and leaping over roots. Max, still running ahead of them, barked furiously as if trying to warn them of the danger closing in. The dog was fast, his powerful legs propelling him through the underbrush, but James could feel the fear gnawing at the back of his mind. Would they be able to outrun whoever was chasing them? Or was it already too late? They broke through the tree line, stumbling onto an open dirt road that wound through the forest. The dark car was still out of sight, but the sound of its engine was unmistakable. It was coming fast. James glanced around, desperately searching for any way out, any place they could hide. But the road was exposed and there was nowhere to go. "We can't stay here," James gasped, clutching the strap of his backpack. "They'll catch us in the open." Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get off the road into the trees again." Without hesitation, they darted back into the forest, veering off the main path and plunging into the thickest part of the woods. Branches scraped against their arms and faces, but they pushed forward, driven by the primal need to survive. As they ran, James's mind raced with questions. Who were these men? What had they uncovered that was so dangerous? And how far were these people willing to go to keep their secrets buried? They had no time to think about it now. Their only goal was to get away. Max barked again, his ears pricked as they neared a steep embankment. James skidded to a stop at the edge, looking down at the rocky slope below. It wasn't a sheer drop, but it was steep enough to make the descent treacherous. Still, it was better than staying on the open road where the car would surely find them. "Down here," James called to Mark, who hesitated for only a moment before nodding in agreement. Carefully, they began to scramble down the embankment, their feet slipping on the loose rocks. James's heart pounded as he grabbed at tree roots and branches to steady himself. Max was already halfway down, his agile body navigating the rough terrain with ease. But just as James was halfway down, he heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching on gravel. The car had reached the spot where they'd been only moments before. "Go! Go!" Mark urged, pushing himself harder as they scrambled toward the bottom. James could feel his legs shaking from the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body screamed for rest, but he knew stopping wasn't an option. They had to keep moving. When they finally reached the bottom of the embankment, James looked up. Through the trees, he could see the dark silhouette of the car parked at the top, its headlights scanning the woods like searchlights. His heart raced. If the men in that car spotted them, it would be over. They ducked low, hiding behind a cluster of large boulders at the base of the slope. James crouched down, pulling Max close to him as the dog panted heavily beside him. Mark was right next to him, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "We can't stay here long," Mark whispered. "They'll come down eventually." James nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't outrun the car forever, and the woods weren't a safe haven anymore. But just as his mind drifted toward despair, he remembered something. The map. The map. James hissed, fumbling with his backpack as he pulled out the old, crinkled piece of paper they had found in the metal box. Mark looked at him, confused. "What about it?" "There were other locations," James whispered, his eyes scanning the map. "Look, there's another spot not far from here. It's marked with coordinates, just like the park." Mark peered over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he studied the map. "You think it's a safe place?" "I don't know," James admitted, "but it's our only lead. If we can get there, maybe we can find shelter, or at least figure out what these people are after." Mark hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, let's go." With the map as their guide, they slipped away from the boulders, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. Max led the way, his ears twitching as he listened for any sign of danger. The dark car was still at the top of the embankment, but for now, it seemed the men hadn't noticed them. They followed the map for what felt like hours, their path winding through the dense forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the ground, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. James's muscles ached from the long trek, but they couldn't afford to stop. Finally, just as the last light of day was fading from the sky, they reached the coordinates marked on the map. The sight that greeted them sent a chill down James's spine. It was another building, much like the one they had found before. But this one was even more deteriorated, the concrete walls crumbling and the roof partially collapsed. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was still somehow alive, as if the secrets it held were waiting, hidden deep inside. "We're here," Mark whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Now what?" James stared at the building, his heart pounding in his chest. The map had led them here, but what they were about to find inside was still a mystery. Before he could answer, Max let out a low growl, his body tense as he stared at the entrance of the building. Someone was inside. James exchanged a glance with Mark, his pulse racing. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. "Let's go," James said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. They moved toward the building, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, but they managed to squeeze through the narrow opening. Inside, the air was musty and stale, just like the previous building. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were lined with shelves, some empty, others filled with dusty, forgotten objects. But at the far end of the room, something caught James's eye. A small door, barely noticeable, was set into the wall. Max growled again, his eyes locked on the door. "We have to see what's inside," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as they approached the door. Slowly, he reached out and turned the handle, the creak of the door echoing through the room. What they saw on the other side made James's blood run cold. James's hand trembled as he pushed open the small door. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing in the eerie silence of the crumbling building. Behind him, Mark and Max stood motionless, their breath heavy with anticipation. As the door creaked open, the light from their flashlights spilled into the hidden room, revealing something that made James's blood run cold. Inside the small, concealed space, there were rows of files stacked neatly on metal shelves. But more than that, in the center of the room was a table. And on that table lay a series of objects that seemed to be relics of something far darker than James had anticipated. A worn, blood-stained coat, an old revolver, and a set of dog tags engraved with names. "What the hell is this place?" Mark whispered, his voice tight with fear. James's pulse quickened as he approached the table, his eyes drawn to the dog tags. They were old, rusted from time, but the names etched into them were still clear. Soldiers? No. Something felt more sinister about this. Max growled softly, standing guard at the door, his ears pricked and alert. Whatever they had found, they weren't alone. "This must have been their hideout," James muttered, sifting through the files. Each one was thick with reports, photographs, and handwritten notes, most of them detailing operations that spanned years, decades even. But they weren't official military records. These weren't normal missions. "This isn't just about one place," Mark said, flipping through a stack of papers. "These people, they've been doing this for years, moving from one site to the next, hiding whatever they're involved in, and I think—" He paused, staring at one of the photos. "I think some of them were never supposed to make it out." James frowned, his hands shaking as he held up one of the dog tags. "You're saying they buried more than just secrets?" Mark nodded grimly. "Exactly. They didn't just hide things, they eliminated anyone who got too close. People disappeared." The weight of the situation settled heavily on James's shoulders. This was bigger than they'd thought, far bigger. The men in those photos weren't just part of a secret operation. They were covering up something terrible. And now, James and Mark had stumbled right into the heart of it. Suddenly, Max barked sharply, his growl deepening as he backed away from the door. James's heart skipped a beat. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder with every passing second. "They're here," Mark whispered, his voice tight with panic. "They must have followed us." James swallowed hard, his mind racing. They had to act fast. If they were caught here, there would be no talking their way out of it. The men outside, they weren't just coming to intimidate them. They were coming to finish what had been started years ago. "We need to get out of here," James said, grabbing as many files as he could and shoving them into his backpack. "We have to take this evidence with us." Mark nodded, doing the same. But before they could make their escape, the door to the building creaked open, and the sound of boots on concrete filled the air. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The men had arrived. Max barked again, louder this time, as if warning them to stay back. But the footsteps continued, getting closer. James glanced at Mark, who was pale with fear, his hands shaking as he stuffed more papers into his bag. "We're trapped," Mark whispered. "There's no way out." James's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the room, they'd be sitting ducks. But the only exit was through the corridor where the men were closing in. Max growled again, his body tense as he stood between the door and the intruders. James knew they didn't have much time. "We'll have to fight our way out," James said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Mark looked at him, wide-eyed. "Are you crazy? We're outnumbered." James grabbed the old revolver from the table, his hand shaking as he checked the chamber. It was loaded, though the bullets were old, and he wasn't sure how reliable they would be. But it was better than nothing. "We don't have a choice," James replied, his voice firm. "We either fight or we die here." Mark hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay, let's do this." They positioned themselves behind the door, ready to ambush whoever came through first. The footsteps grew louder, closer. James's heart raced, his palms sweaty as he gripped the revolver tightly. The door creaked open. In an instant, James and Mark sprang into action. James raised the revolver, firing a shot into the air to startle the intruders. The men outside yelled in surprise, and in the chaos, Mark shoved the door shut, locking them inside. "We have to move," James yelled, grabbing his bag and running toward the back of the building, where they had spotted a small window earlier. Max barked furiously, running alongside them as they bolted through the narrow hallways of the dilapidated structure. The sound of the men pounding on the door behind them echoed through the building, growing louder as they tried to break through. They reached the back of the building, and James scrambled to open the window, pushing the rusted frame until it finally gave way. "Go! Go!" he urged Mark, who climbed through first, followed by Max. James was the last one out, just as the door to the room burst open. The men had made it inside, and they weren't wasting any time. "Run!" James yelled, his voice ragged as they sprinted into the woods. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around them as they ran. Max led the way, his barks echoing through the dense underbrush as they wove through the trees. Behind them, the men gave chase, their footsteps thunderous as they closed in. James's legs burned with exhaustion, his lungs aching from the effort, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to escaping. Up ahead, the woods began to thin, and James spotted the faint glow of headlights through the trees. A car, a way out. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. Just as they reached the clearing, one of the men caught up to them, grabbing James by the arm and yanking him backward. James stumbled, his heart pounding as he struggled to break free. Mark turned, his face pale with fear. "James!" But before the man could pull James to the ground, Max sprang into action. The dog leaped at the man, his teeth sinking into the intruder's arm. The man screamed, releasing James as he tried to fend off the dog's attack. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mark by the arm, pulling him toward the car. They threw open the doors and jumped inside, Max following close behind. With trembling hands, James started the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt as they sped away from the clearing, leaving the men behind in the darkness. As they drove, the adrenaline began to wear off, and James's hands shook uncontrollably on the steering wheel. He glanced over at Mark, who was just as pale and shaken. But they were alive, and they had the evidence. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had survived. And now, with the files and photos they had recovered, they had a chance to bring the truth to light.